The cabin stood alone in the dense, misty woods, like an ancient sentinel, its wooden planks groaning in protest, as if they were tired of the years they had stood guard. Hidden deep within a vast forest, the cabin had long been a place of refuge for adventurers seeking a break from the chaos of modern life. But lately, it had taken on a darker reputation. People would come to stay for a night, and sometimes they did not leave. Sometimes they vanished without a trace. As David and his girlfriend, Lily, pulled up to the secluded location, they felt an eerie chill in the air. The trees were thick, their branches tangled like arms trying to reach out and grab anyone who ventured too close. The sky above was turning a deep shade of orange as the sun began to set, casting long, sinister shadows over the cabin. David had booked the place months ago, eager for a weekend getaway from their hectic jobs. They both needed a break from the city, Lily especially. She worked as an emergency nurse, constantly on call, while David was a software engineer neck-deep in deadlines. The trip to the cabin felt like a perfect escape. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell reception, and was the perfect spot to disconnect from the world. "I love it," David said, grabbing their bags from the car. "Just us, no distractions." Lily, however, felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she stared at the structure. It was rustic, sure. The place was small, made of aged wood that looked sturdy but somehow tired. There were a few stone steps leading up to a porch, which held a couple of rocking chairs, and large windows peeking into the darkness inside. "It's charming," she said hesitantly, forcing a smile. David smiled back, clearly unaware of her discomfort. He tossed his bag over his shoulder and headed toward the door. As soon as he pushed it open, they were met with the smell of old wood and dust. It was as if the cabin had been left untouched for decades. Inside, the place was modest but cozy. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a few worn couches scattered around the living area. The kitchen, though small, had everything they needed for their stay. Lily set down her bag and wandered through the cabin, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. She peered into the single bedroom, which held an old wooden bed with a quilted blanket. It was quaint, almost too perfect for the setting. But something about the way the light from the setting sun filtered through the window and hit the bed made her skin crawl. "David, did you notice there's only one bedroom?" she called out. "Yeah, but who cares?" he laughed. "It's just the two of us." She tried to brush off the uneasy feeling and joined him in the kitchen. He had already opened a bottle of wine and was rummaging through their groceries, pulling out ingredients for dinner. As they cooked, Lily's nerves started to settle. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to her, she thought. The woods were unfamiliar, the silence too quiet compared to the constant hum of city life. After dinner, they settled in front of the fireplace with their glasses of wine. David lit the fire, and the flames crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room. "I could get used to this," David sighed, leaning back into the couch. Lily smiled softly but said nothing. She took a sip of her wine and stared into the fire. The flames flickered in the reflection of the window, and for a moment she thought she saw something move outside. It was just a flicker, a shadow passing by. "Did you see that?" she whispered, sitting up. David looked at her, then at the window. "See what?" "I thought I saw something, someone out there." David chuckled. "It's probably just the wind, or an animal. We're in the middle of the woods, remember?" Lily wasn't convinced, but she nodded and leaned back again, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at her gut. They continued talking and drinking, the wine dulling her nerves. but the fire couldn't warm the chill that seemed to settle in the pit of her stomach. Hours passed, and the fire was dying down. David was already half asleep on the couch. Lily got up and wandered toward the bedroom. She had been trying to shake off the feeling all night, but something just didn't sit right with her. The shadows outside the windows seemed to move every time she glanced at them. As she prepared for bed, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The air in the cabin grew cold to cold. She grabbed the old quilt from the bed and wrapped it around herself, glancing toward the window. That's when she saw it, something in the woods. A dark figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was watching her. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But when she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. The woods outside were dark and still. She rushed back into the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. David was still sprawled on the couch, snoring softly. "David," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred, opening one eye. "What is it?" "There's someone outside." David groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Lily, come on. It's late." "You're just freaking yourself out." "I'm serious. I saw something out there." David sighed and got up, pulling on his jacket. "Fine, I'll take a look." Lily watched as he stepped out onto the porch, a flashlight in hand. The cold night air rushed in, and she shivered. She stood by the door, peering into the darkness beyond the porch. David scanned the area with the flashlight, moving it slowly from side to side. "See," he called out. "Nothing out here." But as soon as the words left his mouth, the light flickered. David froze, shining the beam toward the trees. There, just beyond the porch, was the figure Lily had seen. It stood motionless, watching them. David took a step back. "Okay, maybe there is something out here," he muttered. "Get inside," Lily hissed, pulling him back into the cabin. They slammed the door shut and locked it, their hearts pounding in unison. "What was that?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," David said, staring at the door. "But I don't think it was human." They backed away from the door, retreating toward the bedroom. The air inside the cabin felt thick, oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls made them jump. The cabin seemed to close in around them, the weight of the night pressing down. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted them to know it wasn't leaving. Lily's heart stopped. David grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth, holding it like a weapon. The knocking continued, getting louder with each thud. David motioned for Lily to stay behind him as they moved toward the door. The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the cabin. Then came the scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape of nails against the wooden door. David's hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. But before he could touch it, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Something dark and twisted lunged at them from the shadows. Lily screamed as the figure tackled David, its inhuman strength pinning him to the floor. She grabbed a heavy lamp from the table and swung it with all her might, smashing it over the figure's head. It recoiled, hissing in pain. David scrambled to his feet, pulling Lily toward the bedroom. They slammed the door shut, but the creature was relentless. It pounded against the door, the wood splintering under the force. "We have to get out of here," David yelled, frantically searching for a way out. Lily's eyes darted around the room. The window. It was their only chance. David threw open the window, and they scrambled through just as the door burst open behind them. They ran into the woods, not daring to look back, the creature's snarls echoing in the night. The trees closed in around them, the branches clawing at their skin as they ran. They didn't know where they were going, but anywhere was better than that cabin. Finally, they collapsed at the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. The cabin was far behind them now, but the terror lingered in the air. They sat in silence, trembling as the realization hit them. They had barely escaped with their lives. And somewhere, deep in those dark, twisted woods, the creature still lurked, waiting for its next victim. We had all been looking forward to the sleepover at Lily's house for weeks. It was her 15th birthday, and her parents had promised her the best party yet, a movie marathon, midnight snacks, and no bedtime. Her house was tucked away in a quiet suburb, surrounded by a thick row of trees. It was the perfect setting for a sleepover, cozy, secluded, and far away from the prying eyes of parents. There were 5 of us, me, Lily, Jenna, Ava, and Chloe. We had been best friends since middle school, and this sleepover was our tradition, something we did every few months. But this one I'll never forget. We arrived at Lily's just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her front yard. Her mom had already decorated the living room with balloons and banners, and the smell of freshly baked pizza filled the air. We dumped our bags in Lily's room and immediately headed downstairs to the living room, where the TV was set up for the movie marathon. "Okay, what's first on the list?" Ava asked, grabbing the remote and plopping down on the couch. Lily grinned, holding up a stack of DVDs. "Horror movies, of course. You guys ready?" I wasn't much for horror movies, but I wasn't about to be the only one who chickened out. I settled onto the couch between Jenna and Chloe, grabbing a slice of pizza as the opening credits of the first movie rolled. For the next couple of hours, we watched a series of jump scares, creepy music, and ghosts lurking in the shadows. But nothing about the movies compared to what happened later that night. It was around midnight when we finally turned off the TV. Lily's parents had gone to bed, and the house was dark and quiet. We were all in that giggly, overtired stage, whispering and laughing about random things. Lily suggested we move upstairs to her bedroom to play some games and snack on the junk food we had stashed. As we were getting up to go, Chloe's face suddenly froze, her eyes fixed on the window. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. But then we heard it, a faint tapping sound like something, or someone, knocking on the window. Lily laughed nervously. "It's probably just the wind. These windows always rattle when it's breezy." "No," Chloe said, her voice a bit more urgent now. It sounded like someone knocking. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Lily walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains to reveal nothing but darkness. The yard was still, the trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. "See? It's nothing," she said, letting the curtains fall back into place. "Come on, let's go upstairs." We grabbed our snacks and started up the stairs, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over the group. Lily's bedroom was a safe haven, bright, cheerful, with fairy lights strung across the walls and a fluffy white carpet in the middle of the room. We dumped our snacks on her bed and sat down in a circle, ready for the next phase of the night. Jenna pulled out her phone. "Truth or dare?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," Ava groaned. We all know how this ends, but we all agreed anyway. It was part of the tradition. We started with some light dares, eating weird combinations of snacks, texting silly things to each other's crush. It was all fun and games until Chloe, clearly still rattled from earlier, dared Lily to do something we would all regret. "I dare you to summon a spirit," Chloe said, her voice low and serious. We all laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But the look on her face told us she wasn't. "Are you serious?" Lily asked, her smile faltering. "Come on, it's just a game," Chloe said, though she looked genuinely intrigued. "You've been talking about this house being haunted for years, right? Let's see if it really is." Lily hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged. "Fine, but I don't know how to do that." Jenna, always the one with random knowledge, pulled out her phone and started searching. "There's a simple one: light a candle, ask the spirit to come forward, and wait for a sign." "This is ridiculous," Eva muttered. "But fine, I'll go get a candle." A few minutes later, we were sitting in a circle again, a single candle flickering in the center of the room. The air felt colder, and a strange tension settled over us. Lily took a deep breath. "Okay, here goes. Spirit, if you're here, give us a sign." We all held our breath, waiting. At first, nothing happened. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. I was about to laugh it off when the candle flickered. Not a small flicker, but a sudden, violent gust, as if someone had blown on it. "Did you see that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes wide. "Maybe it's the air conditioning," I offered, though my heart was racing. "There's no vent near here," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, we heard it again, that tapping sound. But this time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the closet. We all turned to look at the closed closet door. It was an old, wooden door with a brass handle, and it had always been a little creepy. But now, in the dim light of the candle, it seemed to loom larger, more menacing. "Stop messing with us," Eva said, her voice shaky. "I'm not," Chloe whispered, her eyes glued to the closet. Then, as if in response to her words, the door creaked open, just an inch. We all screamed, scrambling to our feet. The candle tipped over, plunging the room into darkness. Lily fumbled for the light switch, and when the lights flickered on, the closet door was wide open. But there was nothing inside, just clothes hanging neatly, shoes on the floor. Nothing that could explain the knocking or the door opening on its own. "Okay, I'm done," Eva said, backing toward the door. "This isn't funny anymore." None of us argued. We grabbed our sleeping bags and pillows, deciding to camp out in the living room instead of staying in Lily's room. But even downstairs, the feeling of unease lingered. Every little sound made us jump, and none of us could sleep. Around 3 a.m., when the house was at its quietest, I heard it again. The tapping, but this time, it wasn't coming from the window or the closet. It was coming from inside the house, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was walking down the hallway, tapping on each door. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I felt it, a cold breeze brushing against my cheek, as if someone was standing right next to me. I opened my eyes, expecting to see one of the girls, but there was no one there. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper, "Come play with us." I bolted upright, looking around frantically. The others were all asleep, their faces pale and still. But there, at the edge of the room, standing in the shadows, I saw them, two small figures, their faces obscured, their hands raised as if beckoning me. I screamed, waking everyone up. They turned on the lights, and the figures were gone. But I know what I saw. And I'll never forget the cold, hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and relaxation. My friends and I had planned a camping trip deep in the woods of northern Arizona, far from the stress of our everyday lives. The plan was simple: camp, hike, fish, and enjoy nature. No phones, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. There were 5 of us: me, Zane, my best friend Matt, his girlfriend Sarah, and 2 of our college buddies, Jake and Olivia. We'd all been friends for years, and this trip was supposed to be a reunion of sorts, a way to reconnect after months being caught up in our busy lives. We'd rented a couple of cabins near the edge of the forest, and although they were basic, they were cozy and isolated, just what we wanted. The first day was perfect. The weather was warm, the air crisp and fresh, and the forest surrounding us was teeming with life. We spent the day hiking through the woods, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. That night, we built a bonfire and sat around it, sharing stories, laughing, and toasting marshmallows. Everything was going perfectly, but as the fire died down and the night grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the forest itself had grown still, too still. The usual sounds of the night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, had vanished, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. Do you guys feel that? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Feel what? Jake replied, though I could tell he sensed it too. It's like the forest is watching us, she said, her eyes scanning the trees. It feels off. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension. You're just imagining things, Leave. It's the woods. They can be creepy at night. Matt threw another log on the fire, and the flames roared back to life, casting flickering shadows around the clearing. Yeah, we're miles away from civilization. It's normal to feel a little weirded out. I wanted to agree with him, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was yet. We stayed up for another hour, talking and joking, but the atmosphere had changed. The light-heartedness of earlier had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The cabins weren't far from the campsite, just a short walk through the woods. Matt and Sarah took one cabin, while the rest of us shared the other. It wasn't long before everyone was in bed, trying to get some rest before another day of hiking. But sleep didn't come easy for me. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. My mind kept going back to the silence in the woods earlier, the eerie stillness that had blanketed the forest. Something wasn't right, and then I heard it. A distant, high-pitched scream that echoed through the trees. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. Did you hear that? I whispered to Jake and Olivia, who were both fast asleep in their beds. No response. I held my breath, listening for the sound again. The forest had gone deathly quiet once more, and I began to wonder if I had imagined it. But then, just as I was about to lie back down, the scream came again, louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, my hands trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees and the faint glow of our dying campfire in the distance. But the scream God, it was terrifying. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Without thinking, I ran out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to know what was making that noise. As I crossed the clearing and entered the woods, the scream came again, so close now that I could feel it vibrating in my bones. It was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond the ridge that separated us from the denser part of the woods. Zane, I spun around, my flashlight nearly slipping from my grip. It was Matt, standing at the edge of the clearing, his own flashlight in hand. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, and I don't like it. Let's get the others." And, before he could finish, another scream pierced the air, even louder than before. This time, it was followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, rapid footsteps coming toward us from the darkness. We both froze, our flashlights aimed at the trees. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until we could hear the snapping of branches and the rustling of leaves. Whatever was out there was big, and it was coming straight for us. "Run!" Matt shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the cabin. We sprinted across the clearing, my legs burning as I tried to keep up with him. Behind us, the footsteps thundered through the woods, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. We burst through the cabin door and slammed it shut, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Jake and Olivia were already awake, their faces full of confusion and fear. "What the hell is going on?" Jake demanded. "There's something out there," Matt panted, locking the door behind us. Something big. The cabin shook as a loud thud hit the outside wall, followed by a guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing by, it was hunting us. Olivia whimpered, clutching Jake's arm. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But we need to get out of here." The creature outside scratched at the door, its claws scraping against the wood. The sound was maddening, like nails on a chalkboard. We huddled together in the center of the room, our flashlights off, hoping that the darkness would hide us. But then we heard the voice. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was eerily familiar, almost human, but there was something wrong with it. Something unnatural. "Let me in." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "That's not possible. It can't be." But it was. The voice outside was identical to Matt's, as if the creature had somehow mimicked his speech. "Let me in, it's me, Matt." Matt's face went white. "What the hell?" The door rattled on its hinges as the creature slammed into it again, this time with enough force to crack the wood. We had seconds, maybe less, before it broke through. "We have to move," Jake shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and wedging it under the doorknob. But it was too late. With one final, deafening crash, the door splintered inward, and the creature lunged into the cabin. The sight of it nearly stopped my heart. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with matted fur and limbs that were too long for its body. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. But the worst part was its face. It wasn't fully animal. It had a human quality to it, as if it had once been a person. And that's when I realized what it was, a skinwalker. I had heard the stories before, tales of shapeshifters from Navajo legend, creatures that could take the form of humans or animals to deceive and hunt their prey. But I had never believed them, not until now. The skinwalker lunged at us, its claws swiping through the air as we scattered in different directions. Jake grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and tried to defend himself, but the creature swatted him aside like he was nothing, sending him crashing into the wall. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. We had to get out of the cabin, but the skinwalker was blocking the door. It was too fast, too strong. We didn't stand a chance. "Zane," Matt called from the other side of the room. The window. I turned to see him trying to pry open one of the small cabin windows. It was our only way out. Without thinking, I rushed to help him, using all my strength to force the window open. Olivia and Jake were already climbing through, their faces pale with fear. I pushed Matt out next, just as the skinwalker turned its attention toward us. With a final desperate shove, I forced myself through the window and into the cold night air. The skinwalker roared in anger behind me, its claws slashing at the air as it tried to follow us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, parked a mile away at the trailhead. My lungs burned, my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from that thing as possible. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut as Matt fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The forest had gone silent again, but the memory of the skinwalker's growl echoed in my mind. We never went back to the cabin, and we never spoke of what happened that night. But I still hear the voice sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. My brother, Luke, and I had always been close, especially when it came to our love for the outdoors. Ever since we were kids, we'd go on camping trips with our dad, exploring every inch of the wilderness. After years of college and busy jobs, Luke had come up with the idea of renting a remote cabin deep in the forest for a week of hiking, fishing, and general relaxation. I loved the idea. Life had been hectic, and a chance to disconnect and get back to nature sounded perfect. The cabin was tucked away in a secluded area, miles away from the nearest town. The thick forest surrounding it promised tranquility and the perfect escape from the outside world. We arrived at the cabin on a bright autumn morning. The air was crisp, and the leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red. It was beautiful. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, built from dark timber logs with a stone chimney that made it look like something out of an old postcard. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the two of us and nature. Our first day was peaceful. We unpacked, set up a fire in the hearth, and spent the afternoon fishing at the nearby lake. By the time the sun set, we were sitting around a roaring fire, laughing and telling stories, just like we had done when we were kids. Everything felt perfect, but as the night wore on, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling, like something was watching us from the tree line. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being in such an isolated place. Around midnight, Luke decided to turn in for the night. I wasn't quite tired yet, so I stayed by the fire, staring into the flickering flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was then that I heard it, a distant, low growl, coming from the woods beyond the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a coyote or some other wild animal, but the sound didn't seem right. It was too deep, too guttural, like something much larger than a coyote or a wolf. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the tree line, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. We were deep in the woods, after all, and strange noises were part of the package. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I decided to head inside and get some sleep. The cabin was quiet, the only sound being the crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Luke was already fast asleep in the next room, his snores faintly audible through the wooden walls. I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, kept me on edge. I lay there for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the shadows in the room, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. The growl. This time, it was closer, much closer. It sounded like it was right outside the cabin, maybe even on the porch. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, like whatever was out there was circling the cabin. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? Maybe, but something about the way it moved didn't seem right. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slowly made my way to the window. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated for a moment before pulling them back. The forest was dark, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. But then, just at the edge of the porch, I saw something, a large, shadowy figure, hunched over and moving on all fours. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. Its movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if it was stalking something. Stalking us. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I needed to wake Luke, tell him what I'd seen. But before I could even turn around, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl, louder this time, and so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. My heart was pounding as I rushed to Luke's room, shaking him awake. "Luke, wake up. There's something outside." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about?" "There's something out there," I repeated, my voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." Luke sat up, clearly annoyed, but sensing the urgency in my voice. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and followed me to the window. We both peered outside, but the figure was gone. "See, there's nothing out there," he said, trying to reassure me. But I wasn't convinced. I saw it, Luke. It was right there on the porch. "It's not an animal, not anything I've ever seen," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, let's check it out. Maybe it's a bear or something." I didn't want to go outside, but Luke was already grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. I reluctantly followed, my flashlight in hand, as we stepped out onto the porch. The night was eerily silent. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of crickets and owls just hours earlier, was now deathly quiet. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the trees standing still like silent sentinels. We walked the perimeter of the cabin, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like eyes were following our every move from the shadows. "Maybe it was just a deer or something," Luke said, though his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure from my mind. It was too large, too unnatural. We headed back inside, locking the door behind us. Luke went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, my flashlight in my lap, staring out into the darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself again. Hours passed, and just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd let the isolation and the darkness get to me. But that night, everything changed. It started around midnight again. The growl, low, menacing, and close. This time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin. I bolted upright, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. The sound was coming from the living room. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed out of my room, my hands trembling. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the embers of the fire in the hearth. I swept the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw it, the creature. It was standing in the middle of the room, its hunched figure illuminated by the flashlight beam. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were long and spindly, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. But it was the face that terrified me the most. It was grotesque, almost human but horribly distorted, with wide and blinking eyes that glowed in the dark. For a moment, we locked eyes, and a primal fear surged through me. This thing wasn't natural. It wasn't from this world. The creature let out a guttural growl, its mouth twisting into a snarl as it lunged toward me. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps as it moved closer. I scrambled to my feet, blindly feeling my way through the room. My only thought was to get out of the cabin, out of the woods, as far away from that thing as possible. I made it to the front door, flinging it open and rushing out into the night. The cold air hit my face, but I didn't stop. I ran into the woods, branches whipping against my skin as I sprinted through the trees. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its growls echoing through the forest. It was faster than me, stronger, and I knew I wouldn't be able to outrun it for long. I stumbled over a tree root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to get up, limping through the woods as fast as I could. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw the lights. Headlights in the distance. A car was coming down the dirt road that led to the cabin. I ran toward the lights, waving my arms and screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a local park ranger, jumped out, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. It's in the cabin, a creature. It's after me." The ranger looked confused but alarmed. He radioed for backup and helped me into the car. As we drove away, I looked back toward the cabin, half expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. But there was nothing. The ranger drove me to the nearest town, where I was treated for my injuries. Luke never made it out of the cabin. They found his body a few days later, torn apart as if by some wild animal. But I knew the truth. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that still haunts me to this day. The idea of a remote forest getaway sounded perfect at the time. I had been overworked, exhausted, and just about done with city life. When my friend James suggested we take a week off and rent a cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. A break from the chaos, no phones, no emails, no deadlines, just pure tranquility. The drive out was peaceful. The roads became narrow as we drove deeper into the wilderness, and soon the trees surrounded us like tall, ancient guardians. James and I barely spoke, lost in our own thoughts. As the city disappeared behind us, so did all our stress. The world felt far away, irrelevant. We were entering another realm, one governed by nature. The cabin was perfect. Small, rustic, and isolated, it sat at the edge of a vast forest. You couldn't see any other homes, just endless trees, their leaves already turning orange and red with the onset of fall. A narrow dirt path led into the forest, winding deeper until it disappeared from view. We were alone, or so we thought. After unpacking, we decided to explore the area. The trail behind the cabin led us to a stunning overlook, where the forest stretched out for miles, untouched and wild. We stood there for a while, breathing in the fresh, crisp air, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was everything we had hoped for. But as we headed back to the cabin, something felt off. The forest seemed quieter than before. The birds had stopped chirping, and the wind had died down. The silence was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced at James, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We reached the cabin just as the sun was starting to set. Inside, it was warm and cozy, the wooden walls giving off a comforting sense of security. We lit a fire, made dinner, and settled in for the night. James was in a good mood, cracking jokes and telling stories, but I couldn't stop thinking about the silence in the woods. After dinner, we sat by the fire, drinking and reminiscing about old times. The cabin's windows were large, giving us a clear view of the forest outside. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. But the feeling of being watched persisted. "Do you ever feel like someone's out there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. James raised an eyebrow. "What, like a serial killer hiding in the woods?" I laughed, but it was forced. "No, I don't know. Just something. It's too quiet." James shrugged. "It's just the woods, man. Relax. We're out here to unwind, remember?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about this place didn't feel right, but I didn't want to ruin the trip, so I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and tried to enjoy the evening. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside scratched against the windows, making a soft, scraping sound that set my nerves on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with irrational thoughts. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I rolled over to check the time. 2:37 a.m. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was knocking on the cabin door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could be out here at this hour? We were miles away from the nearest town, and no one knew we were here except for the guy who rented us the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, but the knock didn't come again. I thought about waking James, but he had been drinking, and was probably fast asleep. Besides, it was probably nothing, just the wind or a branch hitting the door. At least, that's what I told myself. The next morning, I brought it up to James over breakfast. He laughed it off, saying I was just spooked from being out in the middle of nowhere. "You've been living in the city too long, man. You're not used to the quiet." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. but I couldn't shake the memory of that knock. We spent the day hiking, exploring the forest, and taking in the beauty of the wilderness. The strange feeling from the night before had faded, replaced by the peace and tranquility of the outdoors. By the time we returned to the cabin, I felt more relaxed, more at ease. That evening, we built another fire, cooked dinner, and talked late into the night. The woods outside were calm, and for the first time since we arrived, I felt like I could truly unwind. But then, around midnight, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. 3 solid knocks, like someone was standing just outside the door, waiting to be let in. James and I exchanged a glance, both of us going silent. The fire crackled in the hearth, but neither of us moved. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Maybe it's a ranger or something," James said, though his voice lacked confidence. At midnight, I whispered back. We both stood up, moving cautiously toward the door. James grabbed a flashlight, and I reached for the fireplace poker, just in case. My heart was pounding in my ears as James opened the door. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the forest beyond dark and silent. James shined the flashlight around, illuminating the trees and the path leading away from the cabin. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone. "See, no one," James said, though his voice was strained. Probably just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. I knew what I had heard. And so had James. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. The rest of the night was tense, both of us on edge waiting for the knocking to return. But it didn't. Eventually, we both fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and unsettled. James was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "Did you hear anything else last night?" I asked, sitting down across from him. He shook his head. "No, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that knocking." We decided to head into town that day, just to get away from the cabin for a while. The drive was long, and the small town we arrived in was quiet, with only a few shops and a diner. We spent the afternoon there, trying to distract ourselves from the weirdness of the previous nights. When we returned to the cabin that evening, the air felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the wind had picked up again, making the trees sway and groan. We went inside, and for the first time since we arrived, I didn't feel safe. The fire did little to chase away the growing sense of dread that had settled over the cabin. James was quieter than usual, and I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was, though neither of us said anything. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, unable to sleep. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and the scratching of branches against the windows was louder than ever. And then, just like before, I heard it, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The window was just a few feet from my bed, the curtains drawn. I could hear the knocks again, 3 slow, deliberate taps, as if someone was standing right outside the window, watching me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was out there. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I reached for the curtains, my hand shaking, and pulled them back. The forest was dark, the trees swaying in the wind. But just beyond the glass, in the faint moonlight, I saw it. A figure. Tall, gaunt, and humanoid, standing just outside the window, its pale face pressed against the glass. Its eyes were wide and blinking, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling off the bed. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. James burst into the room, his face pale. "What the hell's going on? There's someone outside," I shouted, pointing at the window. James rushed to the window, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. We didn't stay another night. We packed up our things in the middle of the night and left the cabin, driving away as fast as we could. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't try to explain it. All I knew was that I never wanted to go back. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't human, and it had been watching us the entire time.